So a story was told about two little brothers. I give them their names, no? James and John. They had finished supper and were playing until bedtime. Somehow, John hit James with a stick, and tears and bitter words followed. Charges and accusations were still being exchanged as their mother prepared them for bed. She said, "Now, boys, what would happen if either of you died tonight and you never had the opportunity again for forgiving one another?" James spoke up, "Well, okay, I will forgive him tonight. But if we are both alive in the morning, he would better look out." So the message of today's readings concerns forgiveness. Each of us stands in need of God's forgiveness. Sirach tells us in the first reading that those who seek God's mercy must be merciful toward others. He spells out the teaching of today's gospel. If anyone who is flesh cherishes wrath, who can forgive his sins? In order to be forgiven, we must learn to forgive. We belong to the Lord, St. Paul says, and we are indebted to one another. He adds, none of us lives for oneself, and no one dies for oneself. We can only truly live when we live for the Lord, and the Lord is always compassionate and merciful. Thus, a song of praise to God, who is kind and merciful, the psalmist proclaims. The readings deal with the healing of hurts between people. They show us the way to resolve differences, to heal the breaches that frequently come between members of families and members of churches, to dissolve the resentments and settle the bitter feuds and the fights that sometimes break out. But now, we want to speak about forgiving one another, the only way to break through the resentment barrier that separates us from each other. Forgiveness, of course, is the virtue we most enjoy, and least employ in our Christian experience. We all love to be forgiven. We expect it and want it, but we find it a struggle to forgive. We resist it and refuse oftentimes to do it. Perhaps many of us have the same difficulty as did the Apostle Peter in the Gospel. Peter, too, was faced with the same problem, the problem of forgiving his brother. In his impetuous bluntness, he comes to Jesus and asks how many times one ought to extend forgiveness to another. He proposes a reasonable number of times, perhaps 7, thinking he is being very magnanimous or generous. So according to the teachings of the Jewish rabbi, a man must forgive his brother only 3 times. It was somehow deduced that God's forgiveness extended only to 3 offenses. Since it was not to be thought that a man could be more gracious than God, forgiveness was limited to 3 times. So 3 strikes and you are out. So Peter expects to be warmly commended. Jesus, however, replied by extending Peter's suggestion by an enormous amount. Not just 7 times should one forgive, but 77 times. Forgiveness for Jesus is not a quantifiable event, a non-calculable number. It is a way of living, a way of loving, a way of relating, and a way of thinking and seeing. It is nothing less than the way of Christ. If we are to follow Christ, then it must become our way as well. I believe, no, and we all agree that forgiveness is hard. If there's one teaching we wish Jesus would not have taught, I guess, no, this is it. Forgiveness is hard, but non-forgiveness is even harder. I would contend, when the heart is full of anger or hatred for someone, when it is most difficult to forgive someone else, the heart grows cold and callous. It is a truism of nature that when the heart is full of a negative feeling, there is no room for good feelings. When one is full of unforgiveness, it eats at the heart, fills the mind, and makes it impossible to grow in love. I think hating, anger, and unforgiveness are a waste of time. They gate us nothing. They remove all positive feelings such as love and kindness, gentleness and joy, and they waste a lot of mental time and energy. It takes too much effort to hate, not to forgive. So, aside from what Jesus teaches about forgiveness, at a very practical level, unforgiveness is a waste of time and energy. We deserve to give ourselves something better than feelings of unforgiveness. So, we won't let someone else control us by causing us not to forgive them. But once again, it's hard. Only God can give us the grace to forgive all others, those who harm us in any way at all. God calls us to immediate and complete forgiveness of others. God is so clear in today's readings. If you do not forgive, how can you possibly ask forgiveness? One of the most important skills we each need is that of knowing how to forgive. There is an African proverb which says, "He who forgives ends the quarrel." Forgiveness builds us up and helps us move on, whereas revenge destroys and creates bitterness. Forgiving helps us to heal our own wounds. Let us move over to healing of our heart, healing of our hearts by the grace God has shown to us. In this way, the healing of the world will ever take place.